The yard went silent. A single shout sliced through the quiet like a knife. Then everything moved at once. Men ran. Hands grabbed. Someone dropped something that clinked on concrete. In the middle of the chaos stood a small group of men in orange jumpsuits. They did not run. They did not hide. They stood tall and spoke with calm voices that carried over the noise. From inside one of Pelican Bay's small, dark cells, a man named Carlos watched it all on a tiny screen. He had been called a boss on the streets. Now he lived in a room with no windows. Even there, he held power. On the screen, a well-dressed prisoner in the yard pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly. Everyone looked at him. He read the paper out loud. The words told guards what to do, where to move, and who would be watched. The men in the yard listened like soldiers taking an order. Then they nodded and moved to new places. The yard split into new lines. The guards looked confused. The plan worked. Carlos smiled but did not laugh. He tapped the concrete wall with his knuckles. Another man in a nearby cell tapped back. Their fingers moved like a drumbeat. That tapping was a code. It was how men in isolation talked to each other. The code could move orders through 10 cells in a minute. The orders could change what happened in the yard an hour later. That day, a fight was stopped not by the guards, but by someone inside a cell. That person had used the code to tell a leader to call off a plan. People wondered how this could happen. How could a person in a small, windowless cell control what men did in a big open yard? How could a boss from the street still lead men from behind metal doors? Those questions began the story of how gang leaders at Pelican Bay ran their empires from inside cages. People outside the prison started to notice. The news showed videos and asked hard questions. The guards held meetings. The state looked for answers. Families watched and worried. The men behind the walls kept tapping. Carlos had been a street king. Before prison, he had made plans on sidewalks and in fast cars. He had a way of making people listen. He did not use loud words or big threats. He used patience. He used a look. He used rules that his men would follow no matter what. Now his world was smaller, but his methods were the same. He had a plan. It was not just to keep power. It was to protect the men he cared about. The idea of power in prison was not always about money or fights. It was about food, about protection, about who would watch your back when a storm came. The leaders learned to run smart, through notes, through visits with lawyers, through legal papers that could be passed along. They learned to hide messages and things no one would suspect. Carlos tapped the wall again. The code moved like a river. It told a man named Marco to watch a corner of Yard B. It told Louis to make sure a younger inmate got water. It told another man to pull back from a fight. Those taps kept lives safer more than people knew. But not everyone followed the leaders. Some men chose to stay away from gangs. Some tried to live quiet. Others were forced into groups because the yard was dangerous and they needed protection. That made the leader's job hard. Power was not only a tool, it was a pull. People wanted in. People wanted out. That made every day tricky. When Carlos first arrived at Pelican Bay, he thought the walls would end him. He thought being in a small box would make the world forget his name. Instead, he learned how to use the boxes. He learned to use the thin slits in the doors to move messages. He learned how food trays could hide notes. He learned which guard walked with a slow step and which one did not look at the floor. He also learned to speak through lawyers. Lawyers could carry messages that the guards had to pass. Legal mail was a shield. The leaders used it like a post office. They wrote words that seemed like a court paper but held codes inside. The codes taught younger men where to go and when to hide. The youth listened because the codes saved lives. One young man named Jamal had come to Pelican Bay with nothing. He was hungry and afraid. He did not want to join any gang, but a man with a soft voice told him one night through the vents that he could be safe. He said, "Follow the rules. Keep your head. Learn to tap." Jamal learned fast. He learned the little drum language. He learned when to move and when to stay quiet. That kept him alive. The leaders also used fear. Not all fear was violent. Some fear was the fear of being alone. Men in prison who had no one would do almost anything to be part of a group that kept them from harm. Leaders would offer a place in their group and then ask for a favor. The favor could be a small job or a big risk. The young men would agree because they needed someone to protect them. Carlos and the other bosses also had enemies. The prison world was split by gangs that did not like each other. The Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, and others had old fights. These fights did not end at the gate. They followed men into every yard and every meal slot. The leaders tried to keep fights away from people who had nothing to do with them. They also learned to punish men who broke the rules. Punishments were not always blows. Sometimes it was being sent to a worse cell, or being cut off from visits, or being named in a file that made life harder. Those small punishments could break a man more than a fight. One cold night, Carlos received a kite, a small folded paper, pushed under his door. The paper had a name and a request. A man in Yard C had been threatened. The leader on that yard wanted Carlos' advice. Carlos read the name and tapped 2 quick beats. Then he wrote a short note and tucked it into his Bible. The next day, a guard carried that Bible to a different wing and handed it to a man who was moving to another cell. That man was careful. He would not look at the paper in front of the guards. He would put it in his socks and hide it under the mattress. The kite would travel again. These moves were like chess. Leaders thought many steps ahead. They used the guards, the legal mail, the visiting hours, the work programs, everything that moved to carry their orders. The power felt invisible. People outside the walls did not believe it was possible. They thought leaders had been caged and that was the end. They were wrong. Not everything the leaders did was bad. Some of their rules stopped worse things from happening. They set up rules for young men so they would not be used in the most dangerous jobs. They told elders to watch the kids. They built quiet signals for trouble. In a strange way, the prison leaders created systems that protected people who might otherwise have been hurt. But their power was not all for protection. Sometimes the leaders used their control to run money schemes. They arranged trades. They sold smuggled goods. They told crews where to hide things. The leaders used fear and loyalty to make money. Out on the streets, families paid for protection. In prison, money moved in small, secret ways. A guard might take a bribe. A visitor might bring contraband. The leaders knew how to keep it all in place. The guards and the warden tried to stop the leaders. They moved some leaders to other prisons. They made rules to stop the kites. They searched every bag. They watched visitors. They used cameras and scanners and more locks. The leaders would lose some power, but they never lost all of it. They adapted. One day, a man named Santos arrived. Santos had been a leader on the streets for years. He had the kind of face that made men listen. He had been moved into the SHU because the state thought it would stop him. Santos had less than most, no sunlight, no yard time, no hands to tap with for a while, but he had the best thing, a sharp mind. Santos watched the yard on a tiny black and white screen. He watched the faces. He watched the shifts. He watched a guard who walked too slow. He knew how to hide a code inside a poem the lawyers brought. He knew how to make a folded paper look like a legal brief. The jailers saw the folded paper and did not think it was dangerous. They did not know the words held a map. Santos wanted to change things. Not for himself only, but for a lot of men he had known before. He tapped the wall and wrote the code. Men began to move differently. The leaders on the yards followed. The yard did not explode this time. It shifted like a giant turning slowly. Nothing caught fire. No one died. That was the moment many outside the walls noticed. An invisible hand moved the prison. News reporters began to ask questions. Families wrote to the governor. The Department of Corrections grew tired of being embarrassed in front of the public. They increased searches and put more cameras in place. The leaders inside adapted. They used older people to pass messages. They used small children's drawings to hide words. They used songs. They used new codes. One morning, a new rule was announced: legal mail would be opened and scanned. Lawyers worried that their clients' secrets could be read by the state. The leaders worried too, because legal mail had been a key route. Santos tapped 3 times against the wall and then 2 more. He told Marco to move a message through a different path. Marco moved quietly. He used a broom to hide a note in a false bottom of a box and left it in the workshop. The note moved that way and reached the right man. But tensions kept rising. One night, a rumor ran like lightning: a leader in another prison had been silenced. It was not the kind of silence that came from being moved. It was a permanent silence. The rumor spread to guards and to men and to families. People worried. The rumor made moves fragile. Fear made plans shaky. The leaders had to be careful. Carlos knew that every step now could be dangerous. He had young men who trusted him. He had family on the outside who asked questions. He had enemies who would use any mistake to harm him. He had the state watching, cameras blinking like small stars everywhere. He had only one place to plan: his small cell, the size of a bathroom, with a bed, a sink, and a tiny vent. On a cold night, Carlos got a visitor. The guard slid open the slot and handed him a folded paper. The paper was unusual. It smelled of new ink and coffee. It had only one sentence written in small, careful letters. Tomorrow, Yahtzee moves at noon. Be ready. Carlos read it once, twice. He tapped the wall slowly. He thought of Jamal and Luis and Santos. He thought of rules that had kept boys alive. He thought of the rumor. He thought of the cameras. He thought of the thing he had promised his mother long ago, to make sure his son grew up safe. He pressed the paper flat and slid it under his pillow. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. The next day, he would have to decide if he would use his power to stop a fight or to win something bigger. He would have to choose between protecting those who trusted him and risking them all for a move that could change everything. In the morning, the sky was thin and cold. The yard filled slowly like a stage preparing for a scene. Men filled spaces, some looking at the ground, some looking at the towers. The camera lenses glittered like insects. Carlos sat in his cell and watched the tiny screen. He felt the tapping under his hand, a beat from another person who was awake and listening. He tapped once back, ready. Then the loudspeaker crackled. Yahtzee, move to position. Guards shouted. The men moved. The plan began. Shoes scuffed. The sun felt very small. The towers hummed. The yard changed shape. Carlos leaned toward the screen. His heart beat in his throat. He tapped 3 times, then 2. A man in Yahtzee looked up. He followed the code and took 1 step to the left. A man near the water fountain moved to cover him. The chain of moves spread like a row of dominoes. 1 small push and many things fell into place. Everything seemed to be going as planned. Then, like a hand pulling an unseen thread, something hit the screen. The image broke into black lines. The feed died. Carlos slapped the screen with an open palm. The tapping stopped. The codes died like a lighthouse going dark. He heard a new sound from the yard, a sound that did not belong to leaders or codes. It was the sound of many boots running, a siren crying, the loudspeaker screaming, a voice shouting a name in a way that made the world shake. Carlos pressed his ear to the cold wall and whispered a name. Santos. He did not hear an answer. The world outside his tiny cell seemed to get closer and closer. The screen stayed dark. The tapping had stopped. He felt trapped and small and very, very afraid. The yard had become a place where plans were made and broken in the space of a heartbeat. The leaders who had once pulled strings from cells now waited. The men in yards listened for a sound that would tell them to move or to stay. The cameras had gone dark, but the danger was still there. Carlos stood and pressed his hands flat on his cell door. He felt the metal hum. He felt the weight of choices. He had to make one more decision that would decide what came next. Outside, boots ran closer. A shout split the air. Carlos whispered into the empty room, "Hold steady." Then the heavy door of his cell opened with a clang. And a voice he had not heard in months said, calm and low, "You need to come with us."